Welcome to the Bucks County Community College Baking and Pastry Arts Podcast. I am Chef John Angeline. Today in the Bake Shop, we're going to go over information about yeast products. This podcast is divided into 3 parts. Part 1 will go over the 12 basic steps of yeast product production. Part 2 will cover mixing methods. And in Part 3, I'll talk about some of the other details about yeast dough production. There are 12 basic steps in the production of yeast products. These steps are used for all yeast products, with some variations depending on what you are making. Number 1. Measure ingredients accurately, weigh dry ingredients on a scale, and measure liquids by volume. Number 2. Mixing. Mixing has 3 purposes: to combine all ingredients into a smooth dough, to distribute the yeast evenly, and to develop gluten. Number 3. Fermentation. Fermentation is the process by which yeast acts on the sugars and starches in the dough to create carbon dioxide gas and alcohol. This action causes the dough to rise. Fermentation is complete when the dough has doubled in size. 4. Punching. Punching dough is the way to deflate the fermented dough. Punching the dough expels carbon dioxide gas, redistributes the yeast, and equalizes the temperature of the dough. Step number 5 is scaling, or dividing the dough into pieces that are of uniform size. 6. Rounding. Rounding is the way to make scaled pieces of dough into smooth, round balls. Rounding simplifies and makes it easier to later shape the dough. 7. Benching. Benching is when the rounded dough is allowed to rest for 10 to 15 minutes before shaping. This rest relaxes the gluten, making the dough easier to work with. It gets its name from the term some bakers use for their tables, or benches. 8. Makeup and panning. At this point, the dough is shaped into loaves or rolls and put into pans if desired. 9. Proofing. Proofing is a continuation of the process of yeast fermentation. Proofing is when the dough rises for the second time. Depending on the yeast product that is being made, proofing time will vary. French bread, for instance, is given a longer proof, while rich doughs are ready when they are slightly underproofed. 10. Baking. The first thing that happens when a yeast product is put in the oven is called oven spring. Oven spring is the rapid rising of a yeast dough in the oven due to the production and expansion of gases. Oven spring occurs during the first 10 minutes or so in the oven. The product will expand to its fullest during this initial baking time. The other changes that happen during the baking of a yeast product are that the product becomes firm and holds its shape, and the formation and browning of the crust. 11. Cooling. Yeast breads baked in loaf pans need to be removed from the pans and placed on wire racks soon after they come out of the oven. The reason to take this step is that moisture will form on the sides and bottom of the pan that will soften the crusts. Breads and rolls baked on sheet pans should be cooled on racks as well. 12. Storing. Fresh baked yeast products should be served the day they are made. For longer storage, they should be frozen. The mixing of yeast product doughs can generally be divided into 3 principal procedures: the straight dough method, the modified straight dough method, and the sponge method. These procedures can be varied depending on the product being made and the preferences of the baker making the dough. I'll go over the straight dough method first. The straight dough method is the way that many breads or yeast products are mixed. The textbook explains this method as combine all of the ingredients in the mixer bowl and mix. I'd like to add some additional instruction to that. Step 1. Depending on what type of yeast is used, it can be dissolved in liquid directly in the mixer bowl. Let it set for a few minutes before going to step 2. Add the salt and optional ingredients such as sugar, egg whites, and shortening. Mix in briefly. Add most, but not all of the flour. With the machine on low speed, mix the dough, adding the remaining flour if necessary. When the dough comes together, mix and knead to develop a smooth dough. All yeast products are not kneaded for the same amount of time. The formula you are making should provide some guidance as to the length of time, but you can learn how to tell if a dough is properly developed with experience. 4. When the dough is done, place it in a greased bowl, large enough so that the dough can double in size, and then cover it with plastic wrap. Modified straight dough method. For doughs that are rich and sweet, ones that contain a high proportion of sugar, fat, and/or eggs, the straight dough method is modified slightly to ensure even mixing. The sugar, fat, and eggs are first blended in before the dough is developed and kneaded. The sponge method. The sponge method of mixing yeast dough can be varied in many different ways. Generally, it will follow the following steps. Combine part or all of the liquid with all or part of the yeast. Part of the flour is added next, and it is mixed in to make a soft dough or batter. This mixture, or sponge, is then allowed to ferment. The fermentation time can be an hour or 2 or longer, such as overnight. After the fermentation time, the dough is punched down, the rest of the flour is added, along with any remaining ingredients, and it is mixed and kneaded to produce a smooth dough. This last section about yeast products will go over some miscellaneous information. Yeast is available in 3 different forms: active dry, instant, and fresh, compressed, or cake yeast. Fresh, compressed, or cake yeast are 3 names for the same thing. All 3 types of yeast, instant, fresh, and active dry, can be used to leaven bread, rolls, or other products. Here are some details about each one. If you're using fresh yeast, dissolve it in water that is about 100 degrees. If you're using active dry yeast, dissolve it in water that is a bit warmer, 105 to 110 degrees. Instant dry yeast is mixed directly with the flour. Fresh yeast is highly perishable and should be stored in the refrigerator. Active dry yeast is perishable as well, but has a much longer shelf life. It can be stored in the refrigerator, at cool room temperature, or in the freezer for longest storage. It should be used before its expiration date for the best results. Instant yeast does not have to be dissolved in water before use. It can be added directly to the flour. Instant yeast is sometimes called rapid rise or quick yeast. Baking temperatures for yeast products are varied depending on the product. Larger units are baked at a lower temperature than smaller ones so that the unit will be completely baked inside when the desired crust color is achieved. Rich or sweet doughs are baked at lower temperatures because their higher fat and sugar content will cause them to brown quicker than lean products. Crust color can be used as an indicator for doneness of the baked yeast product, but you can also use an instant read thermometer to check the internal temperature. A temperature between 195 to 210 degrees will indicate the product is done. A way to tell if a yeast bread or roll is done baking is to pick it up and tap on the bottom. A hollow sound when you tap on the bottom means that the bread is done. A dull sound means that it is not fully baked yet. Some yeast products are brushed with a liquid before they are loaded into the oven. These washes can be water, egg, a starch paste, or a commercially made product. Water is mostly used for hard crusted bread or rolls to aid in the formation of the crust. Egg washes will provide a shiny or golden colored crust. Egg wash can be whole egg, which will give you a golden color and shine, egg yolk, which will provide a deeper golden color, egg white alone, which will make the crust somewhat shiny, and an egg and milk combination, which will provide a medium golden brown color. Starch paste, made from either light rye flour or cornstarch and mixed with water, is primarily used on rye breads to give them their characteristic shiny crust color. Washes can be applied to yeast products by brush or handheld sprayer. The making of yeast products, such as bread or rolls, might seem complicated, but it really isn't. And the results, fresh baked bread, can be delicious. Be sure to check out some of the other baking podcasts in this series. I am Chef John Angeline. Thanks for listening to the Bucks County Community College Baking and Pastry Arts Podcast.